Glenn, how long should this podcast be?
I am as long as possible.
Excellent. Well, more podcasts, more better. The same is true of tabletop miniature games and talking about them. I am Mike Hutchinson, a designer and developer of tabletop miniature games. This is Glenn Ford, also a designer and developer of tabletop miniature games. We have been talking in our recent run of conversations about crunchiness and granularity and complexity and the rhythm of games and how all of these things are very much interrelated, and how you might approach questions of complexity and rhythm in your own designs. So in this conversation, we're going to talk about how long your game should be. And once upon a time, someone told me, having not played A Billion Suns, that it couldn't possibly be any good because it was only 3 turns long, and 3 turns is the incorrect number of turns for a war game.
Yeah.
So let's put that to rights. Glenn, how many turns should a war game have?
Well,
6, isn't it?
It's genuinely weird because, like I say, I was in a conversation just recently on Board Game Geek where somebody in the games design forum asked how, with no other information, how many rounds should my game be? And obviously, there are some people who are like, well, as many rounds as it requires for the questions posed by the initial setup of the game to be answered, the sorts of correct answers.
Yeah, beautiful answer. Textbook.
He said 5, around about 5, between 4 to 6, but 5 ideally, with no other information whatsoever. Nothing else about the game, the nature of the game, how long rounds took, what happened.
Right, well, we can finish this podcast then. The answer is 6.
about 5 or 6. And it's bizarre that rounds are taken to be some sort of actual measurement, like inches or minutes by some people.
Well, so we should start off by saying, like, real time matters. Okay, so your game is likely to have a play time, and it's nice to tell the players coming into your game roughly how long it'll take. And you won't necessarily succeed at your stated goals. I thought that I stated and wrote down on a piece of paper that Gaslands would be a 60-minute game. That's nonsense, people. Yeah. It's not. But if you say to people that it's a 3-hour game and then it plays for roughly 3 hours, that's fine. That's the right length for that game, assuming that it is it remains fun and crunchy and interesting and pleasurable throughout that duration. And then the question is, well, how much time do you want your game to take up? And that, I think, comes down to a bit of the earlier conversation about how kind of granular and complex you think it needs to be, and therefore how much time people need to resolve all of the wonderful subsystems that you've put in. And if by resolving those subsystems they are having, a really fun time and they want to play the game again, even though it took 3 or 4 hours, versus like you've decided to try for a 45-minute or a 60-minute game and you've cut a lot, or even shorter, like a 20-minute game, and you've cut a lot of the complexity out. You've reduced the granularity of like the forces to only having like 4 guys on the table. And you might have zoomed in by only having 4 guys, but you haven't really provided particularly granular rules about whether their bootlaces are untied or how many sandwiches they've eaten. And then I don't know, like, then the question is, well, how many divisions how many loops of that core mechanical system feels pleasurable on the table? Like, how many times do you need to go back round to the initiative phase or whatever your system is? Does it even have initiative phases? Is it something that breaks it up in a different way? Earlier initiative phase video.
Yeah, so I mean, since we now have a Discord server,
I'm so pleased about that. You're going to keep mentioning it.
Somebody complained that I didn't mention it, so I'm mentioning it because that it's people have opinions and it's worth hearing them. But but the point is, I was just in our Discord server, and a splendid member of the Discord asked whether rounds and phases are necessary in the game and what they bring to a design, and what is their purpose? What's the purpose of having phases and rounds? Why don't we just do away with them entirely?
And I've definitely tried and thought about it
And
a fair number of times.
and it's part of why I find it curious that there are people who think that rounds take a specific period of time,
Right.
or
Or that games themselves should be a specific length.
yeah,
Like in terms of, you know, if a round takes 15 minutes and there are 6 of them. I mean, look, I mean, like we talked about activation systems, and alternating activations are essentially not phases. So right there, you've got your kind of standard 2 answers of you either divide the game into rounds and thus into phases, and you give people a swing at each of those phases, either alternating or not. Or you alternate their activations in another way, or you find a more continuous turnovery kind of Blood Bowl sort of style way of doing it. But like Blood Bowl is interesting because Blood Bowl has turnovers, which means that the length of a turn is unpredictable, but also has a fixed number of turns, which means that the game length is super unpredictable. That's probably not true. There's probably some stats that says that game added
well,
specific length.
The thing about Blood Bowl, I mean, you know, this might be a bit of a tangent, is it's weird because it's based on American football, and American football is a sport that has turns. You get a certain number of turns running with the ball, and then if you don't get to a certain point within that number of turns, the other side gets it, which is a really weird thing to have in a sport. It is a little
American football is weird. Hot take here on Rule of Carnage. Come at us, North Americans.
It's a peculiar idea that you get 4 goes, and if you haven't achieved the thing in 4 goes, then you have to give the ball, like, hand it over to the other person, and they get 4 goes. And that's part of why Blood Bowl has its down.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we were talking last time we met about the rhythm of the game and about what story is supposed to unfold. And during the development of A Billion Suns, you were most insistent, I think correctly, on the objective systems being very 3-act in their structure, so that there was some kind of setup, either that literally happens during the sort of setup of the game, or that unfolds in the first turn, where, you know, maybe some ships arrive, or you've put some, you know, diseased asteroids down or something. And then there's a middle bit where you have to go and futz around and collect them or fight over them or whatever. And then there's an end part where you have to, like, collect the remnants or run off with them, or resolve the pirate ship that you found. And so, like, there's a version of a Billion Suns which is 9 turns long, and each of those sections takes about 3 turns to unfold, and that's perfectly fine if the mechanics of the system were such that, you know, resolving one round took, you know, 10 or 15 minutes rather than, you know, 30 to 45 minutes. Then the right number of turns would be, you know, it's basically still the same amount of time. It's just divided up into shorter loops. But the loop is dependent on the complexity of the rules, the amount of time that I have to spend futzing around with things, and also the granularity of the forces. Like, if that game only gave you 3 spaceships, like in X-Wing, then you could do something different. You could have more turns or have more story or whatnot.
I mean, the thing with A Billion Suns is that A Billion Suns could last for an infinite amount of time, because you're allowed to bring on more ships at any.
Don't tempt me.
But, you know, because you can always bring on more ships. It could just go on and on and on. And without that sort of 3-turn structure, there comes a point where it's not financially viable to bring extra ships on for a given player, but there's still points hanging around on the tabletop, and somebody wants to just leave because there's no purpose to their ships being there anymore. And there was an early version where the game ended with quite a slow death, and it was a very sort of, well, what are you going to do this turn? No, nothing. Well, I'll poot round and pick some stuff up. And it's like, well, this is garbage. You know, it's like, bang, this is a space opera movie epic. The credits roll at that point. We don't care about, you know, the little transporter tooting about picking up the last little bits of coal with his space sweeper. It's like, no, bang, we do that there. And the other thing about A Billion Suns is because the board is empty at the start of the game, you have a very clean, definite first act, the arrival. The arrival of the forces from hyperspace, and nobody knew what they were before the 2 of you sat down at that table.
Yeah,
the scene is set. And then we have Act 2, where the scene that is set plays out. And then we have Act 3, where people scoot off with their gear. you know.
Mhm.
And it's like that just breaks down so beautifully into three moments, you know. Why would you want six? And the answer is because, well, what I want is like 2 or 3 or 4 rounds in act one, or 2 or 3 or 4 in act two. And it's like, well, you don't know how long a round is, you don't know how much happens in a round. I could have a round of 1,000 turns. It doesn't, you know, it's not
Right,
about
and I think one of the yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is that like people are quite used, I think, to an action economy where you have about 8 models or 8 elements, because you pretty much always have about 8 elements in anything like this, 7 plus or minus 3 or whatever, and then you have two action points for each of those elements, and then you have 5 or 6 turns on which to spend it. So it's like that's your pocket money, and if you get given less than that, you feel like you've been shortchanged. And so I think part of the like 3 turns is not enough for a billion suns is like saying, well, I normally get 20 quid from my gran at Christmas and she's only given me a tenner. What the hell? But I think one thing that's interesting about a billion suns is that when you start actually putting the game on the table, you realize that the command points give you access to this double move, and potentially a different way of like activating your units, such that in some cases you kind of feel like you did get 6 turns worth of activations in only 3 turns, because your fastest ships, or the ones that you spent the points on, do get to be a lot busier than perhaps you'd normally expect. But I think that the almost the like mental stickiness of like, well, it's going to turn up and then do almost nothing, and then the game's going to end. Like I didn't have enough time to play with the toy. And as we were talking about in the rhythm before, like if you put a unit on the table and it's not given enough oxygen to do what it is cool, why you thought it was cool and what you wanted to see it done, then that is disappointing, and that is a failure of the game's design to sort of deliver on the promise of like, well, this was going to be a cool tank or a cool spaceship, and it never got to do the cool spaceship things. But I don't perceive in A Billion Suns that the way that the game works denies you that fun. It just hurries you and just says, quick, be a spaceship really fast.
Well, I think also there's a question about crunchiness. You know, relating to what we said in the previous conversation, is that A Billion Suns turns are immensely ask a lot of you.
Mm.
It's like whenever I sort of intro it to people and tell people about it and explain it to people, people get a quite shell-shocked look.
Yeah, no, it's
After.
super unforgiving because you don't get many chances to undo the failure, the mistakes you've made.
Yeah.
Like people talk about like certain like Warhammer Age of Sigmar armies as more forgiving because you can make bad tactical choices, but they have enough toughness to like weather being in the wrong place, or you picking the wrong units to go toe to toe with.
Yeah,
in A Billion Suns, like you don't have cash to, you don't have resources in terms of activations or money to buy spaceships to like make up for a set of bad decisions in the first turn.
And the decisions you have to make in that turn require you to encompass the entire game in your head. It's like having a blowtorch put on you, like the first
3-dimensional chess, anyone?
Well, yeah, and to put people through a lot,
5 turns of that.
5 turns of A Billion Suns wouldn't
just be cool.
Well, I mean, we play tested, and mentioned there was a guy who like came to the place where we were play testing, and it was a point where we didn't have that 3-turn limit, and it was a very intense, long thing. And he came to the club and he played it, and he was like, never came back to the club again.
Yeah,
because it's a hell of a thing to put people.
Well, he walked in at a very delicate moment in that game when it was just mercilessly unpleasant to play.
Yeah,
and some might argue it's still still not the friendliest game.
No,
but at least it's only 3 turns long, eh?
Well, and this is the thing, and this is the question about how long a game should or shouldn't be, and it is like, how exhausting is it playing your game? And it can be a really good thing that playing your game is a mentally exhausting sort of process. It can be incredibly satisfying to play a game and at the end of it just be like, wow, that took me to the cleaners. But there's a limit to how long you can do that to somebody for. If your game is a slow burn for like an hour or two, where it's a lot of muttering and moving things around, and then like in the 3.5 hour mark, it kicks off, and then all of that building is paid off in half an hour of glorious events. Then 4 hours is the perfect time for it. But if your game is like A Billion Suns, like putting somebody under a blowtorch, don't force the poor bastards to be under there for like for two or three.
The other thing that's important about that is that throwing back a few weeks to like granularity and not being the same as crunchiness, like there's a bunch of decisions in the design of A Billion Suns which are not particularly detailed granular systems. So the way that you move ships, like it isn't like full thrust, it doesn't have kind of momentum and angular momentum, and you can point in a different direction to traveling. It doesn't really have any concept of the current speed of the vessel or accelerating. It doesn't have any like damage subsystems for what's going on this massive capital ship, which would be like a really natural thing, which was, there had been in systems in that for a while of like, well, what happens if the engines have gone or the bridge is gone or what, blah, blah, blah. And so there's a bunch of detail that one might expect to find in a spaceship game, particularly one where there's only, in some cases, like half a dozen ships on the field. But the reason that I took all of that, much of that granularity and detail out of the rules was that complexity was just too much on top of the crunchiness of thinking about the strategic and the tactical situation, that I wanted to spend more and more of my energy thinking about the geometric puzzle and the resource management puzzle and the sort of prediction and prescience of my opponent, and anything that was getting in the way of that by providing some little ribbons and bows, just like get that out. I don't even want to have to remember that rule exists because it's distracting me from the core fun loop.
Yeah, and again, it's a question about, like you say, the granularity, the focus, the placement of your game. When we were first talking about Billion Suns, there was this idea that you're the sort of the mega commander in his capital ship, looking at like a heads down display of these like hologram versions of corvettes and things, like pushing them around, and it's in many ways not meant to be a physical representation of those ships moving through a three-dimensional space. It's like, I've seen people make comments about Billion Suns. It's like, well, it doesn't have, angular momentum, so it's not really a spaceship game. It's like, well, it's not that spaceship game. It's this spaceship game. It's that thing where, like the overgeneral is looking at this thing, and of course that display on his command room doesn't show the angular momentum of how those ships are moving. It abstracts it to saying, well, it started there and it ended there. It doesn't say, oh, by the way, the pilot had to do a bit of a thing and a slide turn and a back around to get it to that point. He's not going to give a damn about that because it's not relevant to the world that game is existing in. It obviously happened. It was obviously true that there was angular momentum in the movement of those ships, but that doesn't get reported back to the command post. It doesn't get represented on the holograms, and that's because that's not what this game is about. And judging a game on the things that it's not about and that it's not trying to do, because there's one version of looking at this thing that requires certain things to be simulated, is just, maybe it's our fault for not communicating the actual meaning of the game, but it's not the right way to judge a thing, and it's not a right way to write a game trying to make sure that nobody ever says something like that about your game. Somebody will pop up and go, this isn't a blah blah game because it didn't do blah blah, and you're going to say, well, it wasn't that one, it was my one. It's they're all right and they're all wrong, and it's fine that it doesn't happen to do some of those things.
Do you think that there's an important sort of, back on the topic of game length specifically, do you think it's important for a game, whether it's a tabletop miniature game or not, I suppose, to be fairly consistent in its length? Like, is that decent behavior as a games designer? Or is it okay for wild variants to exist if the fun remains juicy?
In relation to like rounds and phases, and whether rounds do an important thing.
Oh yeah.
one of the things I think is one of the things I think that rounds do that is important is that if your game is 5 rounds long and we're on round 3, we'd better be halfway through the game.
Oh, right. So it provides your players with a time check mechanism.
A time check mechanism, a game state check mechanism.
Right, because you can do that. Like Settlers of Catan will do that because we can all pretty much open information, see how many victory points are on the table, and therefore we know that we're at like 7 out of 10 victory points, so we know roughly where we're at.
Yeah, I want to know that, and I understand that turns get quicker in these sorts of games because of the nature of zeroing and moving off units.
Hmm.
But I need to know that I can do roughly what I did in the amount of stuff I could have done with each given unit in the first 2 turns that I can do in the second 2 turns. It's something.
Well, and it's quite common for turns 3 and 4 to be significantly longer because there's more rules systems engaging because there's more shooting and more combat and blah blah
Yeah,
blah.
but rounds are important to let people be able to judge the game state, be able to judge, where are we? Well, it's round 5 and it's only a 5 round game. All right, well, I need to go and do that thing and that thing because the game's about to end. Or we're on round 3. Well, I'm about halfway through, and I got to that stage in the battlefield, so I can probably get to that stage. Lovely, fine. Whereas, if round 4 is like, oh, in round 4 time is doubled, so things move half as quickly as they did on round 3. It's like, well, that's a horrible thing to do to people. Don't assault people with that. I think that
Design challenge, gentle listener.
I think that if a game suddenly takes longer, for one version of it than it did for all the previous versions of it, it needs to be because the players turned a knob that they knew that they were turning,
Right.
the warranty by turning it. I mean, I know how long a game of Warhammer takes. I've played games of Warhammer that have taken 5 times that time because I knew that I was cranking a particular lever up to 11, and I knew what I was getting into. If I played a game of Warhammer of like 2,000 points and it took me an hour, and then I played one the week after and it took me 4 hours, that would be a garbage game, and that's horrible. I in relation to digital games, there's a game that I really love called Sea of Thieves. And the thing is about it's always the worst thing when you love a game and then it does something that you hate. And the thing I hate about Sea of Thieves is there's no way of telling how long your game session is going to be. It is impossible to block.
Right, because it has a sort of narrative arc inside every session where you have to put your trousers on, get in your boat, go and do some piracy, and then come back and wash your face.
And yeah, and you can't just stop in the middle of a session, and emergent story things might add an extra half hour onto your game session, and once that half hour is added on, you're stuck with it. And so I can never go, I've got 2 hours, I'll play Sea of Thieves, because it's like, oh, it turns out today your Sea of Thieves session was 2.5 hours. Although last week you tried to do exactly the same thing and it was an hour, and then you were like, what do I do with my other hour? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll play a game that has properly planned out gaming sessions that I can stop, and a game that lets me decide how long I'm playing it for. And that's what it is. It's impolite when a game tells you how long you're going to play that game for. I want to tell
that's super interesting because I think that the kinds of games that we write, with the exception of the scale system in A Billion Suns, which I don't think is exactly this, it's like these types of games don't tend to provide the opportunity for bite-size engagement because they tend to involve a fair amount of physical setup, or they expect an arc that's a certain shape. Like I'm thinking of, like, as you were talking about that, like, I'm still playing Elden Ring, and I can drop in for 10 minutes and just try and like have a couple of goes at one boss, or like just get to the next checkpoint. And if I want to play for 10 minutes, I can. And also I can just quit the game and the dude will just be standing there when I come back, in the same spot. But there's no equivalent in much of the games that I have written. There's no equivalence for that. You could set up a small racetrack in Gaslands and play that in 20 minutes, I suppose. You could take a game like Relic Blade and play for 20 minutes there. And so maybe that's the answer. Is it's like, well, there's just smaller, compacter versions of things. But it's interesting to think that the narrative arc is sort of assumed in much of these rule systems, rather than there is a pleasurable set of levers, pull the levers for as much time as you've got available to pull the levers, and you might get to a story beat, but other than that, the pleasure is just there.
Well, but I mean, the thing is, I think that's the nature of versus games, whether they're digital or not. I think the nature of a game you're playing against another person is that it comes as a set game. And whatever game I'm playing, if I'm playing another human being, what I don't get to do is go 20 minutes was actually how much I wanted to play. I'm going off now. Let's leave the board set up. You sit there. I'll be back later.
But equally, if we both wanted to play Warhammer for 20 minutes and we spent 10 minutes setting up the game, and then we spent the first turn doing some of the magic phase and some of the movement phase, and then we had to stop, like, that game wouldn't have provided anything remotely like the thing it was supposed to do. I suppose we could set up 2 units and set them up 8 inches apart and charge them together. I suppose that was always available to us.
Well, but I mean, okay, look, I mean, plenty of times I've set up games of Warhammer, played a certain amount of them, and then left them for days, and then come back to them and continue playing them. The thing about board games is brilliant. Is once you leave, they stay in that state,
right? And they're mostly flat, so you can put a table over them or whatever.
Yeah, if you've got a nice gaming table that has a load-in thing, you can store it away there for ages. So they save perfectly well. And the thing is about if you're a solo tabletop gamer, every solo tabletop gamer I know leaves their solo game set up sometimes, plays for as long as they want to, and goes away again. Now,
yeah, that's true. I've done that a ton with Perilous Tales.
The fact that a unit of game for these versus games is like 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it happens to be, and you can't go, well, I'm having a half-hour version of that game. It's like, well, that's fairly persistent against most games. You can't, you can go, well, we're going to play 15 minutes of soccer or rugby, but that's not a proper game of soccer or rugby. A proper game of soccer that has to take a certain unit of time. And if I'm playing a versus game in a digital game, they take a certain period of time, and I can save halfway through, and we can all agree to come back. But that's how long they happen to take. The point is, your game takes the amount of time it takes. Everybody understands how much time it takes, and it doesn't take more or less than that unless you turn some levers and tweak some things. And if you want to break off halfway
that have labels stuck to them going, game length will increase.
Yeah. And if you want to break off halfway through, our games don't go, no, you can't break off halfway through. You are handcuffed to the table and you will play until this thing is completed, or you have to pack the game away entirely. It's up to you. You can leave it set up and come back to it later.
Because it's funny in Hobgoblin, I made deployment 16 inches apart rather than 24 inches because I don't care for the first turn in games of Warhammer. I prefer to just get stuck in. But the rules absolutely permit you to both set up your armies such that they are 24 inches away, and therefore you get an additional turn of futzing about. The game says it's 5 turns long, but you can just decide it's 6 turns long. And so I suppose to a degree it's like I have made a statement in the design and maybe even underlined it with a commentary, but that's only the toolkit that I've given you to have fun with it. Because I was sort of thinking as we were talking there, maybe in a game like this, I should provide if you've only got 20 minutes, here's the lunchtime version of the game. And it's we'll just take 3 units and set them up within 8 inches of each other. And, I don't need to tell you that, but I also don't need to design games for you. The point of the activity is if you want someone to act as a games master for you so that you don't have to invent fun, then, why not provide, wildly varied playtime options that actually function.
I mean, I think the thing is to say, look, this game is at its best at this, played for this period of time, this number of points for this number of people. It'll work if you play with fewer points. It'll work if you play with more points. And have a go of that. And if that's what you're looking for, it'll work fine for that. It's ironic because the last test game of Hobgoblin we played, you took a shooting army and set back further from the possible sort of setup level. And I was like, I thought you didn't like this hanging back part of the game. And
play testing, yeah.
You shot up my monstrous infantry as best you could. Yes, but
Spoilers, gentle viewer, it did not end well.
Does it? I tell you, this is one of the funny things about playtesting with Mike is that I have a secret condition, which is if Mike doesn't lose, the game might be bad. But if Mike always loses in every single game, and so therefore,
if he wins, there's something wrong
if
with
he
either
wins,
the
there
universe
must be
that
something.
we're currently slipped into, or the game.
Yeah, if Mike wins, there must be something fundamentally flawed with the game because something's gone badly awry there.
I won my other 2 games of Hobgoblin that I played in the States.
Where no one was looking. That's like having like that girlfriend that lives 2 towns over and nobody talks to. I definitely won a game. You weren't there and you couldn't possibly have seen. And we didn't take any photos.
The point is, gentle listener, that I cannot beat Glenn.
Okay, look. That's been a lovely conversation about how long something should take. It was quite a long conversation about how long something should take.
Oh, brutal irony.
In a splendid irony and turn of events. The short answer, I think is the one that I gave from somebody else at the top of the tree, which is, long enough that the questions that are asked by the setup of the game have been well answered. What questions you want to ask and how they get answered are up to you and are up to your design. There isn't a correct number of rounds that game should last. There isn't a correct amount of minutes that game should last. It's about the intensity of the experience, the breaks and the beats and the rhythms of the game and the way that you want it to play out. And nobody should say to you 3 rounds is the wrong number of rounds. It should be 6 rounds or 8. 57 could be the right number of rounds. I don't know what happens in your rounds. I don't know how long your game takes. If it works, if it's fun, if people are the right level of engaged throughout your game, the right level of exhausted or energized or whatever you wanted to do to them at the end of your game, then that was the right amount of time and that was the right number of rounds.
Here.
So hopefully that was the right length of time for this conversation, because this is the point at which we're about to end it. If you have enjoyed this conversation, please do like and subscribe. It means a lot to us.
Push the button, make the machine work, make the machine do the thing.
Smash the various buttons, drop a comment.
They change color. It's very satisfying. They worked hard making those change color. You should reward them with your action.
Press the button, you'll get a tiny little dopamine rush. That fucker.
Not as big as us, though. We'll get an even bigger dopamine rush.
It'll message us and everything, and we'll feel good.
Message Glenn. I turn that off.
Also, drop a comment in the comments section. Tell us about games you think that have gone long, games that you think that have gone short.
Tell us the longest game you've ever played of miniature war games.
If you don't
want to know.
If you don't have a miniatures war game that is still ongoing, then you aren't a proper miniatures war game. There's somewhere in your history. Tell us about the game that you never finished. There's always one, and the one that needs it is still sat somewhere in a shed or a barn, as far as you're aware. Yeah, tell us about a game that
I have a play-by-mail battleship what's the Battlefield Gothic game that's still ongoing. We played 3 turns, and at any moment we could restart that game.
I believe I have there's an army of dwarves and an army of demons in a barn somewhere in a town called Ash. As far as I'm aware, is still standing there and have been there for many years. Tell us about a game system that you think runs short. Tell us about a game system that runs long. Tell us about a game that runs obscenely long but is absolutely perfect despite that fact. Let us know when a game should have been fewer rounds or when it should have been more. Look us up on social media. We are around. We are available. We are speakable too. But for now, and for this conversation, Royal Carnage, I think I'll say thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.